Hurricanes, among the most violent and dangerous of all weather phenomena. And some people think that they are driven increasingly by global warming made by mankind. We have one of the world's top experts on hurricanes joining us in today's program. Stick with us to hear Dr. Neil L. Frank, longtime director of the National Hurricane Center, talk about hurricanes and climate change. So what's the deal? What's the connection between climate change and hurricanes? Indeed, what is real and what's not real about climate change itself? Today on From the Stacks, we have one of the world's top experts on hurricanes. Dr. Neil L. Frank was the director of the National Hurricane Center from 1974 to 1986. That's the longest period that anyone held that office. He's familiar to many Americans around the country from his many television appearances as director of the NHC. And then following that, he was chief meteorologist at the television station KHUOU in Houston, Texas, until his retirement just a few years ago. Dr. Frank holds a PhD in meteorology. He is a longtime scientist in this field and has continued to do his research even after his retirement. And he has become an outspoken critic of those who think that global warming is not only real, which it may very well be, but overwhelmingly driven by human activity and is extremely dangerous, so dangerous as to require spending trillions of dollars trying to stop it. So we're glad to have Dr. Frank on with us today. He is a fellow of the Cornwall Alliance and has been a generous supporter as well. So I hope that you'll all enjoy our conversation this evening. Dr. Frank, Neil, thanks so much for joining us this evening. I'd like to just start off with helping people to get to know you a little bit better. What first got you so interested in weather, in meteorology, climate, that you were willing to pursue the studies so much that it actually became your whole career?
Cal, it's an interesting story. I started out in life to become a basketball coach. I played basketball and tennis at a small school in Kansas and had every intention of becoming a basketball coach. And I ran into the science professor when I was a sophomore in college. And he said, Neil, you need to come on over and major in science. And said, no, I'm not interested. He said, if you become a science teacher, that'll give you a competitive edge over all your friends that are phys ed majors when you go to get a job, because they're always looking for science majors. So that's the way I got into science. And when I graduated from college, draft was mandatory, and I knew that I was going to go to the Army. And so I started looking around and then found out that the Air Force was looking for science majors to go into meteorology. Now, you remember I told you my main commitment was phys ed and basketball, so I didn't work that hard at the science, and I wasn't sure what meteorology was all about, but it sounded better than 2 years in the Army, so I signed out real quick and found out that meteorology wasn't the study of meteors at all. And the Air Force then sent me to Okinawa, and I spent a couple of years on Okinawa, and I was introduced into the whole concept of the tropics. As a matter of fact, the first year I was on Okinawa, I was in 3 typhoons. If you're on Okinawa, there's either one coming or one is over you or one is leaving you. It's a wild place in the summertime. And so I fell in love with the tropics and I fell in love with weather. And so when I retired from the Air Force, I decided I had more time invested in weather than I did in basketball coaching. So I went back to the graduate school at Florida State and eventually received my master's and PhDs, and then joined the Hurricane Center in 1961 and was there for 25 years. Had the privilege of serving as the director for 14 years before I retired from there in 1987. And then I joined the KHOU the TV station in Houston and served there 21 years before I finally retired.
Sounds like a long and an amazing career full of exciting things to learn. You just revealed to me another connection that you and I have, Okinawa. My father fought there during World War II, and I was grateful for his service and grateful for your service to our country. Thank you so much. Now, Neil, I know that you are a really committed Christian man, and I've found it interesting through the years to discover that an awful lot of meteorologists seem to be Christians, and they seem to see some connection between their Christian faith and their interest in meteorology. Is that the case for you? How does your
Well, it's
Christian
certainly
faith
from the
interact with your
standpoint of
interest?
science. Yeah,
Pardon?
my Christian commitment was one of the major commitments that I made in life. I was born and
Uh-huh.
raised in a small town in northwest Kansas. My grandparents were both Christian. My parents were Christian. So I was raised in a Christian environment. And in that sense, I inherited a Christian set of moral values. And I married my wife, come from that same kind of a background. So we were always in church. But it wasn't until I was in my 30s that I was challenged to make a real commitment to the church. I would say that the church for me was just a set of moral standards that we were
Hmm.
comfortable with. But when I was challenged with this person of Jesus Christ, then I made a commitment there, and that was the most important
Hmm.
commitment that I've ever made. And once I made that commitment, then I began to see from the science viewpoint. In other words, if you start looking at real data, science will establish that there is a God and there is a personal God, and so it was a major decision for me.
Huh. Wonderful. Well, let's try to dive in now, but kind of snake into it a little bit to this evening's topic. Um, First off, I'd like to just ask you, what are the differences as you see them between meteorology on the one hand and climatology on the other hand? There seems to be, I think, some confusion about those things, and it's been interesting to me to just ask a variety of different scholars about that. What's your own thinking on that?
Well, climatology is the long term pattern. In other words, meteorology deals with the day to day. And that's what most of my career was forecasting what's going to happen tomorrow, what's going to happen 2 days from now. While
Okay.
climatology says, let's average the values over a time period of a month or 2 months or maybe a year. And let's see if there is patterns in this long term trend. And oftentimes I've been accused, well, you're not a climatologist. Let me tell you, you don't get a PhD in meteorology without understanding something about climatology. And so one of the problems that we have in climatology is somehow they believe that we can apply those meteorological models that have, do very well on a short term and apply them to long term, and that just isn't true.
Yeah, David Legates, I know you know David,
Yes.
is one of our senior fellows with the Cornwall Alliance and has done a lot of work in this field. He did his actual PhD in climatology, but he pointed out to me not long ago um, that most climatology programs now don't include in their training the kind of really advanced work in the differential equations and things like that that meteorologists have to learn in order to do their
Yes.
work in meteorological modeling and forecasting and the like. And for that reason, climatology, in David's view, back when he earned his PhD, and he was one of the earliest to do it, uh, climatology did require that, but it has become a much sort of a softer field. And therefore, an awful lot of people who are climatologists, but not meteorologists,
Right.
don't actually understand the climate system as well as do the meteorologists. Uh, but do meteorologists, I think, tend to be more skeptical of claims of dangerous man-made global warming than climatologists? And if so, why would that be?
Oh, I think that that goes back to the numerical models. Numerical models are a powerful tool that we use as meteorologists, and they're very effective for a few days, maybe 4 days, 5 days, um, but they're not very effective in the long term. And so when we see climatologists say meteorologists models tell us the future, then we're very skeptical about that. But
Yeah,
Cal,
I
the
guess
most important thing, yeah, go ahead.
I've seen the spaghetti model graphs of
Yeah,
trying to predict where hurricanes are going to go, and
right.
by golly, when you get more than 2 or 3 days out, they go all over the place. And it seemed to me, if you can't predict where a hurricane is going more than 2 or 3 days out, how are you going to predict overall climate a century away?
And that's the problem. The climate models that they have are just not accurate. And I think that that's because of the way that they treat carbon dioxide. But more important, as far as the meteorologist is concerned, when you start looking at the data, then you find out the
Mhm.
data doesn't support the position that the alarmists make about carbon dioxide being a major
Uh,
factor. And I'm
hmm.
not sure that the climatologists really look at the details of the data so much as we do
Hmm.
as meteorologists.
Okay. Now, we often hear that 97% of all climate scientists believe that global warming is real, that it's man made, and that it's such a threat that we need to spend trillions of dollars trying to prevent it, even though that means not being able to spend that same money on much more urgent things like hunger, lack of pure drinking water, sewage sanitation, medical care, things of that sort. I'd like to ask you to address that claim, but first, I'd like you to speak to a different question. Are all climate scientists, quote and unquote, uh, meteorologists or climatologists? Or are there lots of other specialties counted in that category? In other words, do all climate scientists actually have the scientific training to understand the climate system, how it works, or are many of them out of their depth and just assuming that global warming is real, man-made, and a dire threat, and then talking from their own spheres of training about what to do about it?
Well, it's a question of whether they project downstream on what they can do about it. Listen, you don't get a degree in climatology and certainly an advanced degree in climatology without understanding a good bit about the climate problem. The climate problem is very, very complex. Um, but the problem that you have with alarmists is that they rely a lot on their knowledge about the projection from the numerical models, not from the data
Mhm.
itself. And if you can get the climatologists to go back and take a hard look at the data, then I think that they would be a lot more skeptical.
Well, how about all of the, there are biologists, there are chemists, there are
Right.
physicists, there are, frankly, there are psychologists who get counted in surveys of so-called climate scientists.
Right.
When we look at these claims about, so many climate scientists say, are all of those people really properly trained for understanding climate and meteorology?
Well, that brings us back. You remember now what's it been 3 or 4 years ago when there was 194 scientists sent this letter to Congress and say that you've got to do something about carbon dioxide. And if you remember, I started calling a lot of those people and you looked at the background of these people, and out of the 194 people that signed these letter, there were only 5 climate scientists in that group of people. And something, as I recall, 75% of these were people that had degrees in biology. Well, when I started calling these people that had backgrounds in biology, I called a lot of those professors and I said, "Well, have you looked at the data?" And they said, "No, we form our opinion on what we see in our scientific journals, Nature and Science." Well,
Yeah.
they're misinformed.
Yeah. And part of what disturbed me about that letter was that it presented itself as evangelical academics speaking to climate change.
That's
And
right.
and they didn't make the distinction between those who were actually trained in climate and meteorology versus those who were trained in completely different fields and who had no background by which to
Right.
judge the issue itself. Well, okay, so now let's go to the 97% claim. You've done some
Right.
research on that, and in fact, you wrote an article for the Cornwall Alliance called "What's Wrong with the Claim That 90%,
Right.
97% of climate scientists agree about global warming." So, all right, what's wrong with it?
Okay. Well, it started out with a paper by Cook and a group of people, and they looked at papers that had been published in a 21-year period from 1991 to 2012. And I think there were
Yeah.
12,000 papers that had been published during that period of time on climate change or global warming. Now, they didn't talk to the authors, but they read the abstracts and they determined from the abstract what the opinion of the article was all about. And they divided the response of the abstract into seven different categories. The first category was all of the warming that is taking place is because of
Uh,
carbon dioxide or because of man. At the bottom on the seventh category is no, man is not responsible at all. In the second
mhm.
category, well, man is responsible for over for 50%, but maybe not at all of it. And then in the bottom, the eighth category was, well, the sixth category, maybe man is
Yeah.
responsible for some, but not a lot of it. Now, if you look at the numbers in the first two category, as I recall, 64 of the scientists says, yeah, man is responsible for all of it. And there was 922 that said, well, man is responsible for over 50% of it. Now you look at the bottom, and there was only five that said man is not responsible for any of it. Well, maybe, and there was something like 19. So if you take those first two categories, in other words, about 1,000 of the response of these abstracts said that man was responsible for maybe over 50% of it. In the bottom category, there was only a 25. So the decision or the opinion was that for scientists that had strong opinions, the first two categories, there's 1,000 versus those who found that man was not responsible for that. There was only 25. There's your 95%. Now, the most important result of that paper is there were 11,000 wafflers, as I call them, people that said, well,
Yeah.
man is responsible for some, but not 50%. Well, that was the most
Yeah.
important part of that paper.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Actually, I've got those numbers right in front of me. The third category was man is causing less than 50%. That had 2,910. Okay.
That's
And
right.
then the fourth category was no opinion or uncertain. That was 7,930. The Cook paper just ignored those. You did a great job pointing that out in your
Right,
article, which is on Cornwall Alliance's website,
right.
and we'll put a link up for that in the program. Uh, so so uh, the claim about 97% just seems to me to fall apart. Uh,
Well,
and
John,
yet,
let me mention a couple
there's
of other
another.
things more recent than that.
Yeah.
Um, when our little teenage friend from Sweden was spoke to the United Nations, I think that was back at the end of last year, and maybe in October.
Yeah.
There were 500 international climate scientists had signed a letter that they sent to the CEO of the United Nations, says that there is no climate emergency. That's the most recent
Yeah.
thing. And I can tell you all kinds of surveys that have been made
Yeah.
over the last several years that would dispute this 97%, in spite of
Yeah.
the fact that our previous president used that number often.
Yeah. Well, a lot of skeptics, a lot of critics of dangerous man made global warming ideas claim that science doesn't work by consensus anyway. Uh, what would you say to that? Are you one of those who will argue that way?
Well, absolutely. Okay. I think Huxley said, the tragedy in science is that a great hypothesis it can be destroyed by one scientific fact. So you have
Yeah.
scientists down through history. There's many times when scientists disagreed with the consensus and they were right. And I have to only go back into the period of the 70s and the 80s. Uh, we had a cooling for about 35 years during that period of time. And there was a consensus among all climatologists that we were headed for a little ice age. As a matter of fact, there was a national and international meeting of 42 of the climatists of the world that came together, and they explored this whole question of what's going to happen in terms of weather. And they concluded that we were headed for a little ice age, and they sent President Nixon a letter saying it's time to start storing food because we're going back into a little ice
Mm.
age and we need to have food. Well, the ink on that hadn't even been dried out when the weather started warming. So consensus is not a question of scientific truth.
Yeah, consensus is a political value. You want to know who won an
Absolutely.
event, won an election, you count votes. Science rests on evidence and logic. Good solid understanding of the evidence. Well, before we go on, I would like to just mention to our viewers that this month, for the month of August, the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation is going to be using a special book, a brand new book by Don Deers called Klexit for a Brighter Future. Klexit, that is, exit the climate alarmist movement. Uh, Dr. Don Deers has written this wonderful book. It's very clear, it's reasonably short, easy to understand, arguing that the United States should not only get out of the Paris Climate Agreement, which President Trump announced in June of 2017 we would do, and which should become official just a day or two after the general election, the presidential election this fall. It was a significant process we had to do to get out of the Paris Agreement. But Don Deers argues that we should also exit the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the FCCC, which is the United Nations body that has been sort of the umbrella for all the different attempts to put together treaties to bind countries to fight man-made global warming. Deers, I think, has done a great job in this book of showing why the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has actually been far more harmful than beneficial, and why United States continuing in that is going to be bad, not just for America, but for all the rest of the world. So during the month of August, we will send a free copy of Don Deers's new book, Plexit for a Brighter Future, to anyone who makes a donation to Cornwall Alliance of any size, that's any size, and asks for it. So all you need to do is go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and make your donation of any size. 100% of that donation will be tax deductible. Ask for Plexit, that's Plexit for a Brighter Future, and mention promo code 2008. That's promo code 2008. And we will be glad to send you a copy of Plexit for your enjoyment. Uh, Now, Neil, before we get back
Cal,
to
can I
talking
can I
about
say
climate
Cal?
change, sure,
Can I say a
yeah,
word about that Paris Agreement that
yeah,
kind of teases your book? Okay, because
okay,
I've looked into that Paris Agreement. This agreement was made in December of
2015,
2015. 194 countries gathered together in Paris, and they agreed that we would all reduce the amount of carbon dioxide. We would all turn to green energy, And it was also agreed that because of developing nations do not have the resources to turn to green energy, that we need to set up a fund and send this money to these developing nations so they can develop green energy. Now, it's
Yeah.
interesting. I wasn't there and I don't know who made the decision, but the decision was made that out of the 194 stations, 150 would be developing nations. That meant that
Yes.
only a small portion would be the donor nations, right? And of the
Yeah.
donor nations, it turned out that there were six countries that were going to be the primary donor nations. That would be France and England and Germany and Sweden and Japan and the United States. Now, in the agreement, this is extremely important. We're going to provide I'm sorry, $100 billion a year, every year, to
Yeah.
send to these 150 developing nations. Now,
Yep.
they decided to get the whole thing in progress. They needed to have $10 billion. So they asked the donor nations to provide the $10 billion. Guess who paid the biggest portion or made a commitment to that? The United States, made a commitment to $3 billion on that. Now, our previous president put $1 billion into that interest. This president said, no, 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 we're going to get out of it. Now, if we got back into it, who's going to pay the $100 billion every year for these developing nations? So we need to
Yeah.
look at
The
that
whole
that Paris Agreement very carefully.
Yeah, that whole thing is, in large measure, a wealth redistribution scheme.
Absolutely.
It's all about moving wealth and intellectual property and technological advance from the advanced countries to the developing countries. And I care. I mean, the whole reason I got into all of this was that I care about making sure that developing countries can really develop, that people can rise out of poverty, and that takes
Absolutely.
money, it takes technology, it takes intellectual property. But
Right.
there are just and right ways to move those, and there are unjust and wrong
Right.
ways to do it. And I think the Paris Agreement is the latter. It's an unjust and wrong way to do it. But before we get back to talking about climate change and hurricanes, I just want to follow up on this a little bit. Neil, would you agree with Don Deers that it would be a good idea for the United States not only to get out of the Paris Agreement, but to leave the whole UN Framework Convention on Climate Change as a whole?
Absolutely. I vote for that.
Okay. All right. So our listeners really do need to read Don's book and understand why. And then they need to be contacting their elected representatives and saying, hey, get us out of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We don't want to be wasting money. We don't want to be trapping people in poverty for long periods of time. All right. Well, Neil, I remember the very first time you and I ever spoke. It was in late 2006, and I had been a guest on a PBS special program, sort of the token conservative on climate change in that show. And in that, I had said that contrary to the widespread fears, global warming ought to cause not more and stronger hurricanes, but fewer and weaker hurricanes. And I said, this is because, according to the greenhouse warming theory, the warming should happen mostly toward the poles, not toward the equator. And as a result, you wind up with less temperature difference between equators and poles. And because a main thing that hurricanes do is to move warm air from the equators to the poles and cold air from the poles to the equator, right? Therefore,
Okay.
you don't have as many or as strong hurricanes. And I got just roasted. I got attacked all over the media for that. And one day I was sitting in my seminary office, right? And of course, I'm not a scientist at all, let alone a climate scientist, although, I've read at this point now, by then I had read probably about 15 books on the science of climate change and hundreds of articles. By now it's, some 60 books on the science and thousands of articles. But at any rate, I was getting just attacked, and people were saying, "You're not a climate scientist. You can't be saying things like this." And then I get this phone call sitting in my seminary office, and I hear this very strong, authoritative voice come on saying, "You don't know me, but I'm Dr. Neil Frank, and I was the director of the National Hurricane Center." And I thought, "Oh no, I have stuck my foot in it this time." And then you said, "And I just called because I wanted to tell you you're absolutely right and you need to stick by your guns." Remember that phone call?
Absolutely.
That was so encouraging. And
Right,
since then, you have been so kind as to continue a friendship with me and to teach me a lot of
right.
things. And you've become a fellow of the Cornwall Alliance, and you've even been supporting us with generous donations. Thank you so much. So recently, a lot of people, including some climate scientists, quote and unquote, have claimed that global warming should cause more frequent and more powerful hurricanes. Uh, and now we're right smack in the middle of your territory. You're really one of the world's top experts on hurricanes. Are these people right? Are they wrong? What's the real relationship between hurricanes and global warming?
Okay, now, Cal, before I even say that, I want to compliment you on your skill and ability to understand the climate problem. As a matter of fact, let me make this statement. Most of the meteorologists that I know, and I worked in the Weather Service for years, and so I know meteorologists there and in school, have not looked into the area of climate change nearly to the extent that you have. You are a lot more knowledgeable about what's actually occurring in climate change or global warming than most meteorologists I know.
Well, thank you.
Now let's turn to the area of hurricanes, and I need to give you some background information uh, in order to justify the statement that I'm about to make. Uh, with because of the way the sun shines on the earth, we get too much heat in the tropics and not enough heat in the polar latitudes. And in order to make it tolerable to live on this planet, we need to mix up this cold and the warm air. And the primary way that we do that is through the winter storm. The winter storm is like a giant egg beater that sweeps across the globe, bringing cold air south and warm air north. Now, in the
Hmm.
summertime, particularly, we get a buildup of heat as the boundary between this cold and warm air moves back into higher latitudes. So you get this big buildup of heat in the tropics, and the tropics have to get rid of that. And the way they
Hmm.
do it is through the hurricane. The hurricane, in a sense, represents the tropical atmosphere boiling. And when this hot air moves into higher latitudes, then we get the balance that we were seeking. All right. Now, what is the
Okay.
primary energy process within a tropical system? Well, it's thunderstorms. Thunderstorms heat the atmosphere. Hot air rises, and so there's no vacuums in the atmosphere. Then air rushes in at the surface level, and we end up with tropical storms or even hurricanes. And then this whole process works very well, and the heat is removed out of the tropics. Now, that is the primary way that hurricanes form. They form in the deep tropics. Now, another way that hurricanes have formed, and this is particularly true in the spring and in the fall, is when you have a cold front that moves down. Now, the energy process in a cold front is far different from the thunderstorms in the tropics. The energy process in a cold front it centers on cold air side by side warm air. Anytime you have
Hmm.
cold air and warm air, then the cold air tries to ride under the warm air, and that creates winds, and that creates your winter storms. So in the spring and the fall, you get a cold front that has moved southward through the winter storm energy process, and it starts tangling with the very warm tropical air, and thunderstorms begin to form. Now, sometimes enough of those thunderstorms form that they heat the atmosphere, and so the whole energy process changes from a winter storm process to a summer storm or a thunderstorm process, and the whole system then converts over into a tropical type system. That process is occurs in the subtropical latitudes, not in the deep tropics. And whether
Hmm.
you name something or you treat it as a winter storm is very subjective. And so a lot of times, when you're making forecasts, you see the warm winds begin to form as a little disturbance forms along a dissipating cold front, and you think, well, maybe I ought to name that, and as it converts to tropical system, then it doesn't convert. So you see, the naming of spring of storms in the spring and the fall can be very, very subjective. All right,
Okay.
let's take a look at
Okay.
this season. Six of our first named storms all formed in the process of the winter storm. We name storms on the basis of their forming along an old cold front. Thunderstorms begin to form, and then we named it. The D storm and the E storm formed in the off of the east coast of the United States. But in the
Right.
process
When
of
you
the thunderstorm
Neil,
forming, well, yes,
Neil, when you refer to the D and E storms, you're referring to the fact that storms are named alphabetically. You know, we do one
yes,
with an A name and then B and so on. Okay, just want to make sure
absolutely.
all our listeners understand that. So those two
Right.
storms, okay, are you saying that those maybe
They
wouldn't have
formed
been
off the
called
East
hurricanes
Coast.
in the past?
Yeah,
Okay.
well, and we named them because it looked like the thunderstorms were taking over. Well, it turns out they didn't.
Uh-huh.
As this weather disturbance moved off to the northeast, it got a resurgence of cold air, and so it went back to a winter type storm. And so then we declassified it. Okay, we turned it back to a winter storm. So you had this major winter storm move into higher latitudes that had its origin as Dolly, a tropical storm. The same way with Edward, a tropical storm that was only a tropical storm less than 24 hours before it then converted over back to a winter storm. Well, this really contaminates the records, because of the six storms this year have all formed during this process. Should we have named those? Well, if the thunderstorm process takes over, yeah, we probably should have named them. But maybe we shouldn't have named those. Maybe we should have just treated them as a winter storm. So you have our six named storms that makes this a very active hurricane season, didn't really form in the tropics at all. The first legitimate tropical storm was the G storm, and it formed in the deep tropics. We follow about 40 to 50 systems that emerge from the coast of Africa, and as they develop out over the open water, about 8 or 10 of those a year develop into a named storm. Well, the G storm was the first legitimate tropical storm. So, has this been a very active hurricane season? Uh, Not from the deep tropics, but it has been active in the subtropics because of the way that the subjective way that we name storms.
So are we more likely now to give a storm a name than we would have been 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago?
Oh, there's no question about it because we have better observing techniques now. And so we name those storms, as opposed to treat them as winter storms. Now, when I was the director of the National Hurricane Center up to 1987, if we had something developed like Dolly or Edward, and we weren't sure that it was converting to a tropical system, we probably would have just treated it as a winter storm, and we would have never put that in our list. So it would not have
Hmm.
been included in the list when I was the director. And so we have six of these storms that were very questionable. Now I want to go back to your original question because your original question says if the higher latitudes warm up, then that suggests that there is less change in temperature between the tropics and the higher latitude. Therefore, we would anticipate that maybe we would find fewer hurricanes and less intense hurricanes than if the opposite was occurring. So, global warming may cause less hurricanes and tropical storms than more. And that's what the data shows. If you take a look at the entire world, hurricanes, tropical storms, uh, typhoons, and in the Indian Ocean
Exactly.
and in Australia, they call them cyclones. They're all the same thing. There has been a 5 to 10% reduction in the number of these kind of storms since 1950. And that same thing has occurred in the Atlantic. We're seeing a reduction in the number of major storms rather
Yeah.
than an increase. So the whole increase that is projected by the alarmists is coming on the basis of what their numerical models predict.
Yeah. Yeah, another friend of ours, Roy Spencer, did his PhD on hurricanes, and now, of course, is a principal research scientist in
Yeah.
climatology and meteorology at the University of Alabama. He also is a senior fellow with the Cornwall Alliance. Roy and I were talking about this at one point, and he said, yeah, it is actually possible that although we might have fewer hurricanes because of global warming, some of them might be a little bit stronger just simply because there's more heat, in the
Yep.
ocean surface, and so you might get
Right.
slightly stronger storms. But he said he thinks generally that would be perhaps an increase of, you know, 1 or 2 miles per hour in sustained
Right.
wind speed. And when you've already got a hurricane of 150 miles per hour,
Yeah.
no great difference in damage is going to come
Right.
from another mile or two per hour.
Right.
What do you think about that? Is Roy onto that pretty solidly?
Yeah, I think he's absolutely right on that. And there's probably indication that some of the storms that we've had over the last few years have been pretty strong. There's been no question about it. Listen, Cal, I want to go back one more time to this whole question of naming storms. There was a
Hmm.
major change in the philosophy of naming storms starting in the 90s. Now, there are two ways that you can determine the strength of a hurricane with weather instruments. Number one, you can fly an airplane out into the storm, drop a little barometer, and it drops down to the surface, and you can measure the pressure. Very accurate. There's no question about that. And there is a direct relationship between the central pressure and the winds that are occurring in a hurricane. So the second way you can determine the strength of a hurricane is to fly into the hurricane, and the Air Force flies in generally at 10,000 feet if you have a full blown hurricane. So you have the winds at 10,000 feet, and there are ways you can convert that wind down to the surface wind. So you have winds that you measure with an airplane, and in recent years, our ability to measure those winds from an airplane has certainly improved. Or you can have the barometric pressure. And so all the time that I was at the Hurricane Center, we paid very close attention to the barometric pressure. And if the pressure doesn't drop down, even though you might observe some strong winds, the winds won't persist unless the pressure does respond. So let me take a scenario. We have an Air Force crew that flies out and they fly through a bunch of thunderstorms out east of the island. Well, it's not unusual if you fly through thunderstorms to find winds of 40 or 50 miles an hour. And so they measure the winds and said, we got 50-mile-an-hour winds. And then they fly back and they said, aren't you going to name that? And I said, well, what has been the pressure? And if they tell me the pressure is quite high, then I would say, let's wait until tomorrow and see if the pressure responds to the increase in winds. And if it doesn't, then we haven't named it. Well, today now, they've decided that they would name things on the basis of wind alone and
Hmm.
not pressure. And so if an
So
airplane
again,
goes
that
out and
means
finds
more
50
named
mile an hour wind,
storms.
yeah, they name it,
So
right? And then if the pressure
more
doesn't
named
drop
storms,
down,
even if there's not really a change in what's happening out there, right?
that's right. That's right. Now, if the pressure responds and it does drop down, then tomorrow, oh, yeah, it is legitimate. And we put a name on it. There's no question about it. And so what's happening now is they find these 50-mile-an-hour winds, but if you ask them what is the pressure, and they tell me, oh no, the pressure is quite high, I said, let's wait. No, they're not waiting. They go ahead and put a name on it. Then tomorrow they find out that the pressure didn't drop and respond to the wind. And so what we're finding in the records now is a lot of the named storms have a lifetime of less than 24 hours. And I
Huh.
would estimate that between that process and naming these winter type storms that develop into hurricanes, that we probably are adding 1 to 3 named storms a year to our records. Now, that's important from the standpoint of somebody that is trying to take the historical records of hurricane and determine whether global warming is causing that or not. And so if you take a
Hmm.
look at some of the, professor at one of our reputable universities, a meteorologist, he takes a look at just the raw data and he said, look at that. There's been an increase in the number of storms. That's got to be global warming. That's not true at all.
Huh. Well, um, some people point to rising figures in terms of property damage caused by hurricanes
Right.
as evidence that global warming, which is happening, right? I mean, we have seen some increase in global average temperature. They'll say this rising property damage is evidence that indeed global warming is causing more hurricanes and stronger ones. What's wrong with that argument?
Well, that's easy. If anyone who's lived along the coastline can understand that. There has been a tremendous increase in the population along the coastlines. Therefore, we have more buildings that are exposed to damage. And is it any surprise that we see these great damages, well, not occur, that great damages occur when we have a major hurricane? So
Yeah.
that is a very, very poor indicator. Let me go back one more point in time, Cal. Within the Atlantic itself, I have come to the conclusion that there is only one legitimate way that we can measure the impact of hurricanes or the increase or decrease of hurricanes on the base of the hurricane records. And that would be to look at the major hurricanes that have made landfall in the lower 48. Now,
Hmm.
I would submit to you that back in even the 1800s, if you had a major hurricane, in other words, one in winds of excess of 110 miles an hour, that it probably would be recorded even in a remote area. Now, you might have had a tropical storm, or you might have had a weak hurricane that made landfall in those areas, and you wouldn't have seen that in the records. But if you look at the major hurricanes, three, fours, or fives, then you'll find that there has been a decrease in the major hurricane landfalls in the United States. There was a tremendous number of major hurricanes made landfall in the 40s and the 50s. As a matter of fact, in
Hmm.
Florida itself, there were 7 major hurricanes in the 40s in a 10-year period. And then in the 50s, there were 6 major hurricanes in the Carolinas. And we haven't seen anything like that since then. As a matter of fact, from 2005 to 2017, a 12-year period when there was no major hurricanes made landfall in the United States. Now, if you look at the records over the last 150 years, we expect a major landfall once every 2 years. So for landfall of major hurricanes, it indicates that we've seen a decrease in the number of hurricanes making landfall in the United States.
Neil, this has been fascinating, and I hope that you'll be willing to come back on the program sometime. Maybe as we get toward the end of this hurricane season, you'll be able to give us a sort of a retrospective on it. But thanks so much for joining us today. The Lord bless you and keep you and face to shine upon you. Uh, my friends, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, this evening. Uh, I would remind you that we are offering, as our way of saying thanks for a donation of literally any size, Dr. Don Deers's new book, Klexit for a Bright Future. It's all about why the United States should get out of not just the Paris Climate Agreement, but also the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is a wonderful book. It's about 120 pages or so, very clearly written. And I would just encourage you to get this, read it, and then begin communicating to your elected officials at the congressional level and even in your state legislature about why the U.S. should plex it, leave the climate, the whole climate change framework from the UN. All you need to do is go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, make a donation of any size, and in the comments field, ask for Klexit and mention promo code 2008. That's promo code 2008. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and God bless you, and have a great week to come.